We're going to pick up this second recording about the impact of World War II in Europe, where we left off with the first, which was a discussion of why the U.S. and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers after World War II, and there were some military and economic and political reasons for that. Pretty much Europe became the new battleground for the Cold War. From 1945, which is when World War II ended, up until 1949, there were going to be some conflicts that broke out across Europe involving issues regarding Germany and other locations like Poland that set the stage for this ongoing tension between us and the Soviet Union, which would last until the early 1990s, and it's known as the Cold War. For our country, these conflicts required us to become very international minded and involved in issues not just in Europe, but later on in Asia and the Middle East and Africa. So clearly we could no longer retreat to isolationism like we had after World War I. That was no longer going to be an opportunity anymore. There's a good quote by Richard Overy, who we've looked at previously when we were talking about the causes of World War II. At the top of page 179, he basically talks about these issues between us and the Soviets. We distrusted the Soviet Union for a lot of reasons, the main one being that they were a communist country, and the fact that they had signed an agreement with Hitler at the beginning of World War II. We just simply had an ideological divide that we could not overcome. They wanted certain things to happen in Eastern Europe. We were directly opposed to that. There's no way to resolve that conflict. They were incompatible. And Overy kind of brings that out in that quote from his book, Why the Allies Won, at the top of page 179. So pretty much now the superpowers are going to dominate the world scene, whereas before the old colonial empires of Europe, like Great Britain and France, had once dominated. They would no longer ever regain the status that they had before World War II. I would encourage you again to look back at the map at page 177, showing the divide of Europe, which was the foundation of the Cold War. Pretty much Europe was divided along what was called the Iron Curtain, which is a phrase that Winston Churchill had coined in 1946 in giving a speech to a college in Missouri. The fact that he described Stalin's efforts as forcing communism in Eastern Europe and sealing off that part of Europe from the rest of the world with an quote-unquote Iron Curtain of communism. So our country was directly opposed to that and willing to take actions to stop it. Now let's take a look at specifically what happened in Western European nations as opposed to Eastern European nations, which were the reflection of this initial divide and tension between us and the Soviet Union. In Western Europe, the biggest issue that we were concerned about was the economic recovery. As I said in the first recording, that many of the winning countries of World War II, such as Great Britain, were in just as bad of shape economically as the Axis countries that had fallen. And it would take a massive restructuring of their economic system, their infrastructure, their factories, everything had to be built back up again. And we knew that many of these countries could not afford to do so. So the question was, were we going to step in and help them recover, or just let them try to recover on their own and be vulnerable to radicals like Hitler stepping into the scene and trying to influence these countries with their ideas? So the fact that both us and the Soviet Union were willing to get involved in the recovery of Europe, but obviously with different methods, also contributed to this growing divide between us, which was the Cold War. Our answer for the economic situation in Western Europe was something called the Marshall Plan. And it was basically the idea that if we pumped huge amounts of money into the countries of Western Europe, they would become stable again and less likely to fall to communism. And you can see that mentioned on page 179, both under the heading that says Western Europe and also the sidebar about the Marshall Plan. As much as $16 billion was pumped into these countries over the next years, and it did contribute to their success. In the next 2 decades of the 50s and 60s did see a lot of sustained economic growth for these countries. The Soviets rejected this plan and basically forced the countries of Eastern Europe to not be able to accept it either, which is why it was mostly a Western European program. But the central idea behind it was the fear of communism on our part, and we felt like we could prop these countries up enough economically so that they would not become communist. This is in addition to something called the Truman Doctrine, which is based on what was called the Containment Philosophy. And that's not mentioned in your book, but let me explain it real quick. In 1947, President Truman was concerned over some issues in the countries of Greece and Turkey, where they were being threatened with communist takeover. And from that scare that we had, he basically relied on some of his advisors to suggest what the U.S. course of action should be. One of his advisors was named George Kennan, and he studied the issue and sent a very long telegram to President Truman. It was over 4,000 words in length, and it detailed the Soviets' goals and what they were doing in Eastern Europe and how it would play out if the U.S. did not step in. So the result of that telegram is what was called the Containment Philosophy. Truman announced this containment philosophy in what was known as the Truman Doctrine, which said that we were going to intervene in Europe to prevent communist takeovers of different countries that needed assistance if they were facing subjugation by the Soviets. So basically our political approach in Western Europe was the Truman Doctrine, which was based on containment, and economically we were using the Marshall Plan, designed by another advisor of Truman, George Marshall. And so the two of these ideas together was what helped stabilize Western Europe. If you go to Europe today, you can still see a pretty big contrast between the countries of Western Europe as opposed to Eastern Europe, where the Soviets had control for so many decades. Another trend in Western Europe after World War II was what you can see here, the establishment of multi-party democracies. Many people in these countries of Western Europe, more than anything, just longed for a return to normal. And some of the statesmen, which were the government leaders of different countries who had been there for decades, even going back to the pre-World War I period, many people in these countries saw those kinds of individuals as safe people that had been through a lot of things, that knew the traditions of the countries, and there was just a desire to return to forms of government that were not radical like what the fascism and the communism was in the years between the two world wars. If you look at the quote in the middle of page 179 by Tony Judt, he basically describes this phenomenon that took place in Western Europe and how people were desiring something that was familiar and normal to them. And so what played out was the idea of having multi-party democracies where people could identify with something that made them feel comfortable from before these two world wars that were so chaotic for them. Another big idea politically that emerged in Western Europe was the idea of the countries, the states, taking the responsibility socially for different things for their people, such as healthcare. And so in a number of these Western European countries, there emerged socialism, which is different from communism. Socialism is basically the expectation that the government is going to provide social services. It's also known as the welfare state. This was seen in countries like Great Britain, where you can see that at the bottom of page 179, the man who came to power after Churchill was named Clement Attlee, and he established this type of a system in Great Britain. And he actually came up with the phrase that the government is responsible for taking care of its citizens from the cradle to the grave. So that idea of government responsibility for social services came out after World War II, again, because of the devastation that people were facing, and they needed help with getting back on their feet again. And this socialism in Europe has lasted to the present day. Many countries in Western Europe have socialized medicine, and so therefore it's a direct reflection of these years after World War II. In addition to that, there was a stress for countries in Western Europe to cooperate more in the future as opposed to the competition that had been the highlight of the first part of the 20th century. So there emerged something called the ECSC, or European Coal and Steel Community. It formed with 6 initial nations, but later on was expanded into the European Economic Community, and then ultimately these countries became not only a part of the UN, but also a part of the European Union, which is something that exists today across Europe. Many countries, I believe it's up to 25 or 26 now, are involved in the European Union. So the foundation for that type of cooperation was set in Western Europe after World War II. These countries obviously learned their lesson that competition and imperialism just led to conflict and problems and ultimately wars. So economic cooperation could solve many of those issues by having countries rely upon each other. There was a direct contrast to how Eastern Europe evolved in the years after World War II because of the fact that the Soviets wanted to exercise communist control in the countries of Eastern Europe, which again you can see those countries in the map on page 177. Stalin was able to send communist leaders into the countries and influence the elections of these countries so that they emerged as communist governments. It wasn't that the Soviets outright annexed these countries, but they did influence elections to a high degree. So even though Stalin had promised free elections across Eastern Europe, on the surface they might have appeared to be that way, but they were definitely manipulated underneath the surface. Not only that, the Soviets wanted to not only have communism as the form of government, but they wanted to make sure that with communism is the idea that there's no social classes, that production is controlled by the government as to the needs of the people. So you can see here that the nationalization of private enterprise, so no more private businesses, and the government controlling things like heavy industry and agriculture, which had been done in the Soviet Union prior to the years of World War II with his 5-year plans, which weren't exactly successful for the Soviets, but it was his philosophy of how the government should control the economy. Pretty much the Soviets, another reason why they wanted Eastern Europe was so that they could integrate the economies of Eastern European countries into their own economy to help offset some of their own weaknesses. So this is definitely a selfish motive, but it does show that Stalin was interested in more than just having these countries be communist. It was to directly benefit the Soviet Union with industry and agriculture. So to that end, the Soviets established what was called Comecon, which if you look at page 180, it stands for the Council for the Mutual Economic Assistance. This was not a program like the Marshall Plan in Western Europe that offered countries financial aid to get back on their feet. This was the idea that the Soviets would directly tell these countries in Eastern Europe what they had to produce, whether it be coal or other items, and they would be expected to produce that for the Soviet Union in whatever capacity was determined. You can see an example of this also on page 180, where Poland was expected to produce huge amounts of coal. So these countries were not allowed to make decisions independently, nor were they able to cooperate economically with other countries in Eastern Europe. So this is exploitation at its highest degree. And it did not have a good effect on either the Soviet Union economically or Eastern Europe, because the decisions and priorities that were set didn't necessarily match what was actually needed, nor the way that it was went about effective either. So the bottom line with Comecon was basically that Eastern Europe did not experience the economic rebirth that the countries in Western Europe did. And because they were kept down and not able to make independent decisions for the good of their own people, Eastern European countries severely lagged behind Western European countries in their transformation after World War II, which again, that's why if you visit Europe today, you can still see some effects of this if you go to countries in Eastern Europe where they're still trying to catch up in different means like technology and economy versus the countries in Western Europe. The way that the USSR kept these Eastern European countries under their control was basically through fear and force. Many Soviet agents were sent into these countries and manipulated the situations there. You can also see some other tactics used by the Soviets at the middle of page 180, things such as censorship and suppression of religious freedoms, political purges, and military presence of troops. Cominform stands for Communist Information, and basically it was a tool designed like Comintern to gather necessary information about communist activities in different countries so that the Soviets could control the situation to their advantage. So finally, to summarize this second recording about the impact of World War II in Europe, there was definitely a division across the continent of Europe between East and West, and it would remain that way for 40 years. On the Western side, the U.S. was the dominant influence, and our philosophies of democracy and free enterprise allowed the countries in Western Europe to have recovery and cooperation through things like the Marshall Plan and what became the European Union. In addition to that, we also established the first ever peacetime military alliance called NATO, which stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Most of the countries in Western Europe were a part of this organization, which still exists today as well. So while Western Europe was prospering and getting back on their feet, the countries in Eastern Europe, which is also known as the Soviet Bloc, were kept down, where you had force and fear implemented on them, and they were directly controlled by the Soviet Union and not allowed to make independent decisions. So even though this so-called protection from the Soviet Union that they called the Warsaw Pact was supposed to offer these countries improvement, it did little to that end. The next recording will pick up with the impact of World War II in Asian countries.